support. My last word is for the so-called survivors and families of the deceased, with big, huge psychological trauma, because one of the specificities of Ebola is that it decimates families. So you have people who have lost a lot of relatives, and the survivors in particular, because not only there's lost families, but they still suffer from stigmatization. And let's not forget that roughly 1 out of 2 still suffer from physical after effects, loss of hearing, loss of eyesight, fatigue, etc., etc. So, because once again, now the size of this outbreak, there is a large number of people who will still be suffering from the consequences, physical, including the physical consequences of the virus. Thank you.
There's a lot here. I'll try to be brief. I've got all these things starred that I want to respond to, and now I've got like 25 stars in the past 3 pages. So what do I want? So okay. Let's a couple words on the CivMil piece. The CivMil wasn't triggered by the Security Council resolution. It was from the U.S. perspective, the calculation that we made in choosing to deploy the military was, so whenever we deploy our military in response to a humanitarian crisis, the military actually is coming in explicitly in support of USAID, and so they are there under our oversight's not quite the right word, but they are there responding to the priorities that we set out for them. And as we looked at this situation, we were not in early September confident that the NGO community was going to show up in force, or that the UN was going to show up in force. Both eventually did, and that enabled us to begin shifting roles off our military earlier than we initially expected and onto the civilian agencies, which is how we normally do it. But at that point, it really was not clear whether we would be able to rely on the NGO community and the UN to do all the things that needed to be done and at the scale that they needed to be done. We knew some would show up, but would enough show up? What the military brought was not just resources. Obviously, they do bring resources, but it was scale. And if you need to suddenly go and build 15 field hospitals of a type that, of a size that have never been previously built in any previous outbreak and so on, the military can bring a level of resourcing and manpower to that's hard to find elsewhere. So that was really the calculus for us on that. It was also, of course, an important show of solidarity and a signal to the world that this is an important thing. This is not just your everyday emergency, and the world really needs to gear up. Ian, to your point, and I want to just say I really appreciated your comments at WHS today as well on the NGO perspective and the closing. I thought those were great. So your observation about what are the recommendations for improving the system, I think, ties to the gentleman from MSF who asked the question, who made the observation about accountability for performance. It shouldn't take a cataclysm like this for us to look at a UN agency and say, hey, you're not getting this right. So, Bruce and his team are fabulous, but they're small. They've traditionally been under-resourced. They've traditionally been under-supported within the organization. The organization has not institutionally been set up to enable an effective emergency capability. And that was recognized by the executive board in January. It was affirmed by the World Health Assembly in May. And I'm now, I have the privilege of serving on the advisory board that's helping them, so full disclosure, that's helping them to think through how to build that. But I don't think anyone, if you went a year or two back, would have looked at WHO and said, yeah, they've got the emergency capability they need. It should not take a cataclysm for us to hold the UN agencies, and not just the UN agencies, to account for the obligations that they have within the humanitarian architecture. And, WHO is not the only UN agency that is not fulfilling all of its obligations and responsibilities. I'm not going to name names here, but you can guess. And as we look ahead to WHS, this is where I think it really ties to WHS. We need to have a really honest conversation about what does it look like to have a system rather than a landscape of actors? Right now, we have much more of a landscape of actors than a system. What does it mean for UN agencies to fulfill their obligations and responsibility? If you're going to assert that you are the leader for X, that comes with obligations and responsibilities. And frankly, as donors, it comes with obligations and responsibilities for us to hold them to account for that. And if they're not doing it, then we need to be honest about that. So those are two very tied questions. Just one other, there are a lot of recommendations for improving the system, but clearly we need much better interoperability between the global health and outbreak community and the humanitarian community. And so within USAID, we're investing on a pretty significant process along with CDC to build out a level of interoperability with CDC that's going to look a lot like our level of interoperability with the U.S. military. Because if we're going to need to deploy with them, again, we need to know each other's language. We need to know each other's systems. We need to have systems that can interface and talk to each other. We didn't have that when this started out. We need to build that so that we're not meeting each other in real time, but actually know each other going forward. And that's true on a global scale as well between the humanitarian and emergency response communities. And I'll censor myself there, I think.
Thank you so much also for bringing back the system lens. Bruno.
There's 2 or 3 points in conclusion. The first one would be the issue of trust between populations and institutions. And it's been said throughout this panel that the key for behavior change is usually the key for the success against the epidemic. And this is very much related to the level of trust between populations and institutions. And I think we always have to remember that populations will cooperate only if they're convinced they see benefits from the institutions that are supposed to serve them. In a lot of cases where there were the worst outcomes for Ebola, it was very much linked to areas where there was fundamental breakdown of trust between certain populations and the authorities or their perception of organizations, etc. And if the perception they have is policies that are simply walling them off as a response to the epidemic or being mainly coercive, etc., it will produce violence. It will produce, I would say, hiding of the facts, etc. So it's an essential point to try to get straight from the beginning until the end, and it's linked to a multitude of factors, including simply the cares provided, dignity, medical care, all the other cares that are provided. And I think it's very important to keep this on track, including for our own societies, because the reactions are not fundamentally different between Guinea or the way the public reacts in Switzerland or in the United States, and it was actually observable with the very few cases that came abroad here. The second point is maybe what you said, Bruce, about the IHR and do not provide a response mechanism notably for countries that are facing high levels of vulnerability. And if this is not addressed, there will be a repetition of the same. And I think, maybe I don't formulate it properly, but today we have a concept which is about the protection of security of societies, of trade, of movement, etc. It is not a response mechanism to major epidemics. And it has to be very well understood because it will happen again. And the third is simply to insist on research and development because there will be more of these challenges, and tools can be found in the meantime to fight future epidemics. And actually, Ebola is a very good illustration of this.
Your concluding remarks.
Yeah.
2 minutes.
Well,
please.
the first